Um, Welcome. We're very excited today to have Professor Doug Tallamy with us as our guest. I remember when we did our first native plant program at the library, and we first started trying to do these sorts of programs. Um, Doug Tallamy was always the person that was like the one person we'd really like to have visit us because he wasn't just the speaker at the library. He was this person that they wanted to speak to and that they talked about as being the person they went to for knowledge. So we're so glad to have him here today and to join us for this interview. Um, we have a few questions for Mr. Tallamy, me and my fellow librarians, and then, like I said, if you want to type any questions you have, or at the end you can ask questions. But for now, we just wanted to ask some of those questions we had been talking about. So welcome, Doug Tallamy. He's the author of Nature's Best Hope, Bringing Nature Home, and a professor of entomology at the University of Delaware. And he's the father of the native plant gardening. And one of our guests already was telling him that he's the godfather of their organization. So everybody is very inspired by what he has done. But as the first question I wanted to ask is that this new book has come out, but in recent months, some of the events with which we're all familiar have really changed the world. And I wanted to know, has that changed your perspective or the message of your book? The world has changed a lot, but has your message changed or its importance?
Well, my message, hi, Peter, thanks for the invitation. Happy to be here. My message has not changed, but the way people interpret it and their willingness to actually read the book might have changed. Our lives really have been turned upside down, where most people, at least in the early months, were stuck at home. We're not used to doing that. Very little travel, so we actually had more free time. And a lot of people have rediscovered the natural world, even if it's just in their yard, or they've taken up gardening, or they've taken up bird watching. And that, of course, is step one into reconnecting with nature. We humans are part of nature. We can't exist without it. Any attempt to destroy it, as Rachel Carson once said, a war on nature is a war on ourselves. But that message has been lost in recent decades. 82% of us live in cities, and we just don't think about the natural world that is absolutely essential, which means we don't think about how we're losing it. So the virus might help us get back on track and start to put things in perspective again. There are also some tangible benefits, and in Nature's Best Hope, I talk about creating a homegrown national park. We're going to restore natural ecosystems right on the property where we live, or we work, or we play. And the advantage to that is, of course, is that those places never close. If you actually have some life in your yard, you can go outside, you can commune with nature, you can, that's restorative. And it's a great antidote to depression. There's lots of positives. And unlike our national parks, it is not closed. It is open all the time. So there's an advantage there as well. Somebody at some point is going to take some statistics about the number of people that have reconnected with nature in different ways because of this pandemic, and I'd be interested in to see that. But I predict it's going to be a lot.
Yeah, I found it very enjoyable as an opportunity to go for walks and things like that. One of the worst parts at the early stage was when some of the small local parks were closed to people. But yeah, having nature in your own backyard, it's part of the reason it's so important.
The other advantage of that is you get to experience it alone and at your own pace and whenever you're ready. If we go to a park, we're not alone. What we're experiencing is a whole bunch of other people trying to experience nature, and From a social perspective, that there's an upside. From a pandemic perspective, that's a downside. We really don't want to be close to a lot of people. But I have found that the most meaningful experiences with nature happen when you are alone. It's you and the bird, it's you and the plant, and nobody else getting in the way. And that's particularly true for children. Let them experience it when they're ready, without parental supervision. Let them just go out and experience it. Those are the things they're going to remember the rest of their lives.
Hmm. Did you have any other points and tips for people who are looking to get more involved in nature in this way, like starting their own garden with native plants, or perhaps changing what they do have to be more native or natural?
Yeah, I've got a lot, a lot of tips about that. Most of it, there's almost none of us who can't improve the ecological integrity of the property we own. That includes me. There's lots of things that we could do on our own property that would make it even better. So this is a great time to start working at that. But a lot of people haven't ever thought about this. They've got a big lawn and a few plants from Asia, and they say, well, how do I start? Um, there are four things that I think every piece of the earth, or at least terrestrial earth, needs to be accomplishing. And if we work towards accomplishing each one of those goals, then we're doing the right thing. One of them would be welcoming our spaces to other living things, which means we need to create viable food webs. So we have to have plants that are going to pass energy on to other living things. If you want a bird breeding in your yard, it's not going to be there if it doesn't have the insects it needs to feed its young. And those insects aren't going to be there unless they have the plants that support them. And most of the ornamental plants we use commonly from Asia do not support our insects. And we've learned in recent years, most of the insects that birds are feeding their young are caterpillars. So we always try to simplify. We need to build landscapes that make lots of caterpillars. How do we do that? We have to put the plants in that those caterpillars eat. And that's not the way we've been thinking well, ever when in gardening. We always wanted to create landscapes with no insects at all. Well, those are dead landscapes. So number one, we want to create viable food webs by putting in the plants that support the insects that support everything else. Number two, we want to sequester carbon. We want to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and lock it up in the soil. What does that? Plants do that. So we want to add more plants to our property than are currently there. Most people can do that pretty easily by reducing the area that's in lawn. I always talk about cutting the area having lawn in half, because and we've got over 40 million acres of lawn in the US, which is bigger than the size of New England. And we keep adding to that all the time. It's a default landscape that's essentially a deadscape. There's nothing happening on the lawn. So depending on where you live, the easiest thing to do is plant a tree, plant 2 trees, and reduce the area that's in lawn. That tree is built out of carbon. It's photosynthesizing and building its tissues out of carbon that it's pulled out of the air. But even more important that a lot of people don't realize is that tree, as a matter of fact, every plant on your property is pumping the extra carbon that it fixes from the atmosphere into the soil. That's why our soil is brown or black. It's from carbon that plants have put there. So, any of our prairie plants, they're not very big, although some of them have very deep root systems, but they're pumping carbon into the soil. A prairie ecosystem is almost as productive in terms of sequestering carbon as a full-fledged forest. So those are really important plants that we can get into our yards that are taking carbon out of the atmosphere. Third thing we need to do is support viable, actually diverse food pollinator food webs. We want to support our pollinators, is what I'm trying to say. We have, and by that I'm really talking about our native bees. We have 4,000 species of native bees. Most of them we know very little about, but the ones we do know about, they're all in decline for the same reason that the honeybees in decline. They don't have enough forage. We're not treating what they need very well. So supporting Pollinators on your property is really important. And people wonder, well, why do I have to do that on my property? Why can't that happen in a park someplace? Well, it does need to happen in a park someplace, but we need pollinators everywhere, not just in our parks and our preserves. Again, most people think we need pollinators just to help agriculture. No, that's the last reason we need pollinators. We need them because they're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. So if we lose our pollinators, we lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet. And that's simply not an option. So everywhere you want plants, which is everywhere, you need pollinators. And that means we need to support pollinator reproduction and housing right where we live. And the fourth thing we need to do on our properties is protect our watersheds. And it's plants that do that. So any plant with a big root system is far better than your lawn with tiny root systems. It absorbs rainfall, minimizes runoff, purifies the water before it gets to our aquatic systems. And of course, when you have well-planted yard, you're not adding a lot of fertilizer. You're not putting in herbicides, so it's not going to rush off and destroy the aquatic ecosystems. So those are the four things that we need to do. How do you do that? There's 1,000 ways to do that, but all of them involve adding plants to your yard.
I think we have a question also on that subject from Jerry, who asks, how can we do it within a budget?
Okay. In the fall, the acorns drop. They're absolutely free. You pick one up and put it in the ground. Doesn't cost a thing. I've got 10 acres. My wife and I have 10 acres in Oxford, Pennsylvania, and it was mowed for hay when we moved in, so very few plants there. So between my wife and me and the squirrels and the blue jays, I'm now actually editing. I'm taking out a lot of the trees and things that are growing there because we've got too many, and they were all free. They were all free. So one of the things that I would encourage you to do, if you're going to plant a tree, plant it small. Everybody wants to buy a 15-foot oak tree or whatever, and that's expensive. It also gives you a 50% chance the tree's going to die because in order to transplant it, it has to be root pruned, or if it's grown in a pot, it is root bound, and those roots will strangle each other over the years, and it'll eventually die. If you plant a tree as a small whip or even a seed, it'll be a far healthier tree, and it will grow just as fast as that big guy. It'll catch up and past it. I've got a story to prove that. I don't have any pictures to show you, but shortly after we moved into our property, my brother-in-law, he actually runs a nursery, had a red oak that was about 15 feet tall, and he had dug it for a client, and the client backed out. So here he has this dug tree. He said, I can't do anything with it. Do you want it? And I said, sure. So we had to dig this giant hole, it's a giant root ball, and it was this big day-long project to get this tree into the ground, but we did it. The same day I planted an acorn from a willow oak that I got from my mother-in-law's house. And he said, what are you doing that for? I said, well, I want a willow oak, So, but here we go. We planted them the same day, and they're about 30 feet apart. Well, today that willow oak is considerably taller than the red oak, and the red oak is dying. It's not going to make it for all the reasons I just mentioned. It never was very, very healthy, but the willow oak, because it started from an acorn, has been extremely healthy, and I don't know what its circumference is now, but it's big. So it's doing really well. It just shows you that in a few years that seedling from a tree, from a small tree, passes those big ones that we think we need. We've got to get past the instant gratification. We want to plant a forest and have it done the first day. That is expensive, and as I said, it doesn't work real well.
That attitude of trying to taking people's considerations into mind when talking about the importance of preserving and reinvigorating the natural world was one of the interesting things about your book because you said you wanted to incentivize people rather than, making certain behavior seem bad. And I know a lot of us here on Seed Saturday are, of course, very for this message, but how would you recommend when we're telling somebody about the importance of these practices? How do we phrase that to make it seem like the sort of thing that would be convincing?
Yeah, it's not a soundbite. It takes a little bit of knowledge to realize why it's important, and in particular, what each individual's responsibility is. We have one home, planet Earth. It's not getting any bigger, and every time we add a new person to it, it makes the challenge of living in the future even more difficult. Uh, but for some reason, we've thought that Earth stewardship is the job of a few specialists. An ecologist here, a conservation biologist there, but everybody else, that doesn't matter. And I have no idea why we've thought that, because everybody requires a healthy environment. Everybody requires productive ecosystems to support them. Whether you live in the middle of New York City or whether you live in the middle of Iowa, it doesn't matter. We all require those services. So why it seems to be culturally acceptable for most people to go out and destroy the ecosystems that support us, and then a few people, and we call them tree huggers, are trying to save it. I mean, that's crazy. So as a resident of planet Earth, you have the responsibility. It's your nest. We're the only species that repeatedly fouls our own nest and thinks it's not going to come back and bite us. I don't know why. So there is a sense of responsibility there. But there's also, we have huge environmental problems, and it's easy to throw your hands up and say there's nothing one person can do. Climate change is a perfect example. If I said, I want you as a group to solve climate change, and I want to measure the results tomorrow. Not going to do that. You can all stop driving your SUVs, and we wouldn't see any difference at all. It's the right thing to do, but it's such a giant problem, which takes collective efforts by so many people. You're not going to see any difference. But if you each go and plant an oak tree in your yard, I can see the difference tomorrow. I really can. I've got a picture of a caterpillar standing on the ground and eating the first set of leaves on a pin oak that has just popped up, because it's such a powerful plant. I talk about keystone plants being the ones that are driving the food webs, and oaks are the #1 keystone plant, certainly in Long Island and all over in 84% of the counties of North America, as a matter of fact. So a single person can do that. You can measure the results. You can see the life come to your yard, and that's motivating. What you're doing is increasing the number of species in your local ecosystem. And it's the number of species in your ecosystem that determines how healthy that ecosystem is, how many ecosystem services it produces. In other words, how much carbon it sequesters, how much water it's cleaning, how many pollinators it supports, all those things we just talked about. And a single person can make a huge difference in that. So I have found that to be the best way to motivate people. I use hooks like birds. A lot of people like birds. A lot more people like birds than they like caterpillars, but caterpillars are bird food, so we can make a connection there. And once they realize, hey, the plants in my yard are important for the birds that I like to watch, they're on board. So I mean, that's where the title of the book comes from. Nature's best hope is you. You are nature's, and there is a responsibility there. So whether or not you take up that responsibility is going to determine whether nature is around in the future. And of course, if it's not, we're not either. So it's an important issue.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that, appealing to people's enjoyment and appreciation of nature in addition to that sense of responsibility. Um, we actually, at the library, we've been having a book club on this topic. It's called Examine Our Endangered Earth, and my fellow librarian, Julia Lane, we were reading your book a few weeks ago, and I know Julia had a few questions as well from the group. Julia?
Yes, thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for coming, Doug. Really, like I said, I'm a huge fan, and we read your book for my book discussion. A number of the patrons who joined me are here today. So I just had a question about the native plants and the insects. The idea being that native plants have evolved along with native insects, and therefore you need to plant native plants to attract the insects. And according to iNaturalist, rue, the kind, I don't know the exact name of it, but rue that I purchased here on Long Island is not native, but yet the caterpillars the black swallowtail caterpillars that I had, that we were speaking of, they devoured the rue. So how did that?
Why is that? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you have zeroed in on one of our most prominent exceptions. It's not really an exception. The reason native plants support more insects than non-native plants is that plants protect themselves. They don't want to be eaten by insects, so they load their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals that make those leaves either bitter or toxic. And the insects that can eat those plants have co-evolved with those chemicals. So they have the adaptations to get around them. They have the enzymes that can store and excrete and break down those chemicals. They have the behavioral adaptations and the life history adaptations that allow them to eat those particular plant lineages without dying. And that's why the monarch butterfly can eat milkweeds without dying. Milkweed's a poisonous plant. Cardiac glycosides. And if I took the milkweed away and said, now you have to eat crepe myrtles, what do you think the monarch would do? It would die. Can't do it because it's locked into what it's specialized on. Well, the black swallowtail is also locked into plants in the parsnip family, and it's specialized on the chemicals in those plants. So even though, then there are a number, like our parsley, our carrots, they're not native to North America, but they're in the same family as the plants that the black swallowtail co-evolved with. And in this particular case, it doesn't always happen, but in this particular case, the chemicals are so similar that the black swallowtail says, okay, here's my host plant, I recognize them, and it already has the machinery to be able to deal with it. That doesn't always happen. So for example, there are a lot of specialists on our native maples, like red maple, silver maple, that cannot eat Norway maple, even though it's a maple, because Norway maple has changed enough that the chemicals are not similar enough that they can eat it. So yeah, that's a confusing example, but that's
Thank you. No, thank you. I was confused because
yeah.
Okay, so they're close enough because they're
it's a close relative,
yeah.
Right?
Okay, super. Okay, I was happy to feed the caterpillars.
Yeah, I'm happy to see them too. I see very few black swallowtails these days.
Yes, they have all crawled away. I imagine. I hope they're on their way to becoming butterflies.
They are.
But
they get to a certain size, the last instar, and they crawl off the plant and they make a chrysalis someplace else. Their natural enemies, mostly little wasps, little parasitoids, find them by finding the host plant. And they want to get away from the host plant so that the enemies cannot find them. When they're a chrysalis, they're helpless as a chrysalis. There's no defense, so they have to hide.
Got it. There is someone in the, thank you very much. There is a question, Peter. Rebecca says, I've noticed a big decline in native bees and butterflies. That's been going on for a while now. That's a big problem. It's not just this year.
Is this a cyclical decline or could it be permanent, she says?
I can tell you in 50 years whether it's permanent, but You know, this spring and last spring and the spring before that, but particularly this spring, it was the coldest, wettest spring, at least in southeast Pennsylvania, that we have had in decades. And cold, wet weather in the springtime is very hard on butterflies that are overwintering as chrysalids. It encourages the diseases that get them, or sometimes they come out too early. We had two nights in May that were in the 20s. Unusually cold, and so it's very hard on those insects that have made it through the year. The bees are overwintering either in stems or in the ground. They're okay, but then they come out and the flowers are behind because there's no forage for them. So they're very slow in trying to start up their colonies. If it's a bumblebee, for example, or the native bees, just they don't have colonies. They're just individuals trying to reproduce. So the spring was hard. It's been hard on them. I do expect the populations to rebuild through the summer and then more in August. But you know, we're having crazy weather. 2 or 3, I guess it was 3 summers ago, there was a thunderstorm that hit our house. I think it was pretty localized, but we got 7 inches of rain in 3 hours. It was like a fire hose. And I'm out looking for caterpillars all the time. And I went out after that. They were gone. I mean, they were hosed off the plants, and the population of moths. I mentioned moths because they're so important in food webs. For every species of butterfly, there's 19 species of moths. They have not recovered yet in my yard. And that single event, a single afternoon of a thunderstorm, which is really hard to pinpoint, and everybody didn't get that, but we get this really erratic weather. So this is where climate change is clobbering insects in ways that it's not just, oh, it's getting slightly warmer. It's the intensity of the storms that's very hard on the insects. But insects are really adaptable, and I hope they adapt pretty fast. They do have wild swings in their populations, so I'm certainly not giving up hope. We put the plants there, they should come back. I added Celtis, hackberry, to my yard, several trees shortly after we moved in. I wanted to see if I get the hackberry butterfly, and I did. But this year, and this is the year where the populations were really down, but even so, I went out in, I guess it was early June, and looked at one of the branches of one of my hackberry trees. There were 9 hackberry emperor caterpillars on there. I'd never seen so many. So, it depends on which species you're talking about and what their overwintering pattern was. But look for more insects in August. I think they're going to bounce back.
Another question we have is that there have been grants from Doreen, there have been grants in the upper Midwest to create rain gardens in communities to manage runoff. And have you heard of a similar effort for our region? And if not, why not? And how can we make it happen?
No, I haven't heard about a similar effort for your region, although I'm not that well connected that it could be happening and I don't know about it. But there are a number of programs popping up around the country. Minnesota, I believe, has a matching program. They will help cost share replacing lawn with prairie plants anywhere in the entire state. Florida is starting a program where if you have a burrowing owl in your front yard, they will pay you to protect it. That's the way the endangered species should be acting. But rather than encouraging you to get rid of it because there's a hole in your lawn. St. Louis, the St. Louis area, or maybe it's all of Missouri, had it's like a bounty on Callery pear, on Bradford pear. If you brought in a Bradford pear body, they would give you a free tree replacement. Those are great programs. Then, of course, you've got the lawn replacement programs in the dry states like California and Arizona, where you're paid to replace your lawn. We should be doing that everywhere. We should be encouraging people financially to get rid of the invasive species on their properties, to build rain gardens, to reduce lawn. It doesn't have to be much, but what that does is make it socially acceptable, so that it shows this is the right thing for our community to be doing. And believe me, once people get permission like that, a lot more people will be on board. They don't want to be the rebel. They don't want to go out and shake things up. But you know, a community-sponsored program really brings in respondents. How do you get it going? You know, we have community leaders. We vote for them. You have to get active and vote for people who think this is important. And I have learned that politicians will support anything if they think it's going to help them get your vote. So whether or not they appreciate why it really is important.
Then we had a question about the oak trees. Is there a rule of thumb for how far we should plant them so that when it finally grows as a big tree, that it will not endanger our house during high winds from two?
Right. Well, there are a number of landscape architects and even landscape designers who are recognizing the value of actually planting trees close together. Because what that does is mimic what's happening in the wild. Trees sink down big root systems, particularly oaks, and when they're close together, they interlock those roots. So it's this matrix of roots underground. If you go to a stream cut where the stream has washed away the soil and there are trees on the side, you can see how the roots are all locked together. And when you get the big winds, if you get a big enough wind, it'll snap the tree off, but it won't pull it over the way our isolated specimen trees get pulled over. Our big trees are particularly vulnerable when they're isolated and we've had a lot of rain, because then the soil's loose and the whole root mat goes up. And that's when it falls on your house, and that's when it falls on your car. And of course, then it's on the TV, and it makes it seem like if you have a tree in your yard, you're really risking your life. And that's because we have always valued specimen trees. We never put them close together because you won't get the full spread of the tree. We need to start thinking about our trees as little tree groves. So it's true, each individual member of that grove might be a little smaller than it would have been on its own, but it's acting as a group. You view it as a group. It's going to create an interlocked canopy along with interlocked root systems. And people have been talking about this just for the last few years, so that we don't have great examples of what it looks like after 50 years. But it sure makes sense to me, and I've been promoting that. Having no trees, I think, is not the answer, because trees do so many good things for us.
And then Terry, high school bio teacher, asks, how would you encourage teenagers to become interested and active in changing the ecosystem at home and school?
Anytime I talk to a high school, which is not that often, people say you should talk to all the schools. Well, there are tens of thousands of schools and only one of me. But the response has been very positive. You know, teenagers, they're all idealistic. They want to help. If you say, here's a problem, you can help it, they are there. They are on board. What they don't have is the background knowledge of what the problem is or what they can actually do to contribute to it. There's a couple of things they can do. One is talk to their parents, get their parents to realize this is an issue. You know, that simple goal of cutting the lawn in half, the area of lawn that's in half, it's a very simple thing to say, but how do you actually do it? Teens can get really involved in that. They can be involved in any of the plantings that I've been talking about. A lot of us live in cities now and don't even own property that could be re-landscaped, but they are near a park or a preserve that desperately needs volunteers. Every one of our parks and preserves around the country are understaffed, underfunded. The maintenance of those parks is it's a huge undertaking. So volunteer at a local place, or let's say your neighbor owns 5 acres, but they're in their 70s and they just don't feel like doing it. Hire on, say, I will do this for you. I will get rid of your Bradford pears and your burning bush and all the other things that you don't want, and I'll help you plant new things. Those are all things that teenagers can do and then feel really good about it, see the results. And another thing they can think about, you know, teenagers, it's really too early to be picking a vocation, but a huge open niche right now is what I call ecological landscaping. Everywhere I go, people say, who can I hire to do this? And in most cases, I say, I have no idea. Because in most cases, we got traditional landscapers, and they're not trained in it. They don't know any more than the homeowner. So it's a big open niche. There are a few programs starting up, training people, but learning about ecological landscaping and then hanging out your shingle, that'd be a great career for a lot of people all over the country, and there's a desperate need for it. So something teenagers could be thinking about. So.
And Matt said, "Hi, Doug. Do you feel that any particular diet aligns with a sustainable philosophy?"
You mean human diet?
Yeah.
Yes. It's well known that meat eating, particularly eating cows, is one of the most destructive things we can be doing to our planet. And you've heard all the statistics, the amount of water per pound that goes into producing a pound of beef, the amount of land. We are cutting down the Brazilian rainforest at this point in order to grow soybeans to sell for cattle feed. And this is just accelerating all over the planet. So reducing your consumption of beef is a huge plus. Supporting the industries that are trying to replace beef with environmentally friendly alternatives like Beyond Beef or the Impossible Burger. I don't know if you've ever tried those, but they're essentially made in the lab and they're really good. I've had the Impossible Burger, and it actually uses heme, which is the same product in our blood, hemoglobin, and it really gives you the taste of beef, but it's like 99% less water and less land and much more environmentally friendly. These are nascent industries that need to grow, but I see that as one of the real steps forward in terms of changing our diets that will have huge environmental benefits.
So would you say like a vegan or vegetarian diet is that what you do? Is that ideal?
I guess that would make you a vegetarian, wouldn't it? But in a way where you're not really missing the meat because it
Yeah.
still tastes like it. Yeah, the basis of it, I guess, is soybeans. But right now, half of terrestrial planet Earth is in agriculture, and it's just about all the arable land that's out there. We can't keep expanding that and still have functional ecosystems. So finding ways to support the huge number of people we have that don't require such huge amounts of land is absolutely necessary.
Oh, Rosa, you had a question as well.
Yeah, I was wondering how you got into the line of work that you're in. Like, was this something that even like as a kid were you interested in nature? Is it something that's always been an interest for you?
Yes, I was born into it. And I can say that, I have a brother and I have a sister. We all grew up in the same house. We all went to the same lake as kids, and neither one of them really got into it. So it just was in my genes. I can't take any credit for it. I like to collect snakes and turtles when I was little. I didn't know anything about insects until college, but I did love the living world. And I had an experience when I was in third grade. We just actually moved to our house in Berkeley Heights, New Jersey, and there was a little pond right next door. And I discovered a lot of things at that pond in the spring. The toads came and sang at the pond. I'd never seen that before. That was so exciting. And then they mated and laid eggs, and the pollywogs grew. And I'd go there every day and watch what was happening. But that same spring, I was sitting there watching the little toads hop out onto the land, and here came a bulldozer, and he buried the pond to build the house next door to me. Well, that made an impression on me. Right then I said, there are too many people. We need to start saving things. The connection I did not make was that it was very common. Everybody said, we need to save what's not destroyed. And of course we do, that's great. But I didn't think at all about what I could do to my own yard to recreate what had already been destroyed. Could have done a lot of things. Never occurred to me. As a matter of fact, didn't occur to me until decades later. So preservation is you know, we still need to preserve whatever is left out there, but there's far more areas that need to be restored, and picking the right plants is the road to that restoration. So that's you know, the aha moment that I finally had around the year 2001. But yeah, I'm embarrassed. I knew everything I needed to know to have that aha moment probably 20 years before that, but sometimes it takes a while. But yeah, I was born into it.
And I had one more question, and then we have a few more from our guests. And if people want to have any more questions or want to make any comments after that. But my last question is a real library question, and I wanted to know, as far as books go, if you had a favorite book, or perhaps a book that you would recommend for people who really enjoyed your own writing.
Well, you have to read all my books. Well, let me start I was actually a very slow reader. Got a little bit of it's not dyslexia, but the brain doesn't work the way it ought to. And I have to read sequentially. So reading was hard for me when I was young. And the first book that really got me into reading was a book called All About Snakes. And again, it was around that third, fourth grade. And I loved that book. I read it, you know, a lot of times. I don't think I read any other books, but I read All About Snakes. I don't know who the author was, but it gave me the message that I could learn things from books. Okay, and I did not know that before then. So All About Snakes got me going. A book I would recommend today, it's a bit dated, but still extremely relevant, would be one of E.O. Wilson's early books, The Diversity of Life. I think it was 1990 or 1992, something like that. Still extraordinarily relevant. And what he does is tell you how important the diversity of the species around us are. This was in the early years of his push to save biodiversity on Earth. But I think it's a great place to start. And if you like his writing and you want to get one of his more important recent books, he wrote Half Earth, came out in 2016, where he essentially said we need to save ecosystem function on half of planet Earth or we're all toast. Now, he didn't talk a lot about how to do that, but he talked about the science that supports that statement. But we know how to do that now. We need to save life where we humans are, not someplace else. The idea that humans and nature cannot coexist, that's old news. We're going to toss that because there's not enough unoccupied land to save nature without humans. We need to save nature everywhere, and that includes where we are. So those would be two books that I would recommend that keep you busy today.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see. Do you think those might make it to your group, Julia?
Sure. I just need to have E.O. Wilson is the author, right?
Right, in both cases.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, and I'll type it into the chat for everybody. E.O. Wilson, The Diversity of Life and Half Earth.
Right.
And Half Earth.
Let's see. And I think we have some more questions if you're able to answer a few more questions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. So what are some small native plants we could plant in a small yard space?
There's a lot of them. I wrote Bringing Nature Home, but after that I helped write The Living Landscape with Rick Dark. And in the back of The Living Landscape, there are lots of charts for different regions of the country that will help you pick plants that perform different ecological roles. And small plants is one of them. We don't, there is, I would say, a shortage of native plant shrubs. There's an awful lot of non-native plant shrubs that we turn to, but one of the reasons for that is we don't have a whole lot of species that stick to the shrub size without getting too big. We do have several species of native viburnums. Viburnum dentatum would be one, arrowleaf viburnum. Viburnum nudum is another one. Those are two good ones. The genus Viburnum supports, I think it's 118 species of moths and butterflies. So it's a very powerful plant you can put in your yard. Witch hazel doesn't get too big, and that's another good plant. Let's see, there's a native hydrangea, Hydrangea arborescens. So the hydrangeas you see everywhere, they're mostly from Asia, but there's a native hydrangea, Hydrangea arborescens. There is a cultivar of that called Annabelle, Hydrangea arborescens Annabelle. But one of the main contributions of Hydrangea arborescens is that it's an excellent pollinator plant. But Annabelle is a selection of that plant where the reproductive parts of the flower have been turned into bracts. So it's big, showy, but it's sterile, which means there's no nectar and pollen for the pollinators. So if you get Hydrangea arborescens, don't get the cultivar Annabelle. Stick with the straight species. There's a lot of herbaceous plants that when they're planted in groups will perform just like small woody plants. Goldenrod, for example, we've got a lot of species of goldenrod. So pick one of the ones that doesn't spread readily, but it is, I say it's one of the keystone plants in the herbaceous form. Supports 12 or 13 species of native bees that can only reproduce on the pollen of goldenrod, and it supports 110 species of caterpillars in this region. So really valuable plant. Evening primrose, Oenothera, is another really valuable plant for pollinators. The native asters are great. They're great for migrating monarchs that need forage. Everybody says the monarchs need milkweeds, and they do when they're reproducing, but when they're migrating all the way down to Mexico, they need nectar all the way down, and that's the forage that's vital. And many of our fall blooming asters are essential. They're one of the last plants to bloom, and some of those monarchs are pretty late. There's a few that are even moving down in November, and they need forage desperately. So that's a great thing to add to your yard. And our sunflowers, no, not the ones that make the seed for the birds. I mean, that's great for the birds, but the perennial sunflowers, where the flowers are much smaller, another great plant for native pollinators. All those things can go into your yard in a fairly small space and still contribute in important ways.
And we also had a question about a garden that's a small garden that's used mainly to grow food, but you don't want the food to be ruined by certain insects. Is there any way to protect it without getting rid of them or using pesticides?
Yeah. Most of the insects that attack our food plants, like cabbage and things, are non-native themselves. Like the cabbage white butterfly is one of the biggest garden pests that homeowners have to deal with. It's tricky and it can be difficult, but if you have a diversity of native plants around your garden, you're supporting the natural enemies that can then help control the pests in your garden. And I'll give you an example for the tomato hornworm or the tobacco hornworm that gets on your tomatoes and everybody gets upset. They eat a lot of your leaves. It's a sphinx moth. And it is attacked by a braconid wasp. When you see all those white bumps on its back, those are cocoons of the braconid wasp that already have eaten out the inside of the caterpillar, and then they tunnel out through its back, they spin a cocoon, and then they'll emerge as a little wasp and fly away. It gives good control for the tobacco hornworm, but you have to have that berconid on your property for it to work. So how do you do that? You have the plants that support other species of sphinx moths. At my house, we have 17 species of sphinx moths, and they all support populations of that berconid wasp. So when the tobacco hornworm comes, because it's not always there, the natural enemies are there already, ready to take advantage of it. So having the diversity of plants that support the other species of sphinx moths is important. Virginia creeper is a good one. There are 3 species of sphinx moths on that alone. Black cherries are important for sphinx moths. Our native ashes, our poor ashes, they support a lot of sphinx moths. So that's what I mean by building in a complex community of natural enemies that can then help control your garden pests.
Sort of related to that, one of the other questions is, can you comment on the non-native mantids, especially the ones sold in nurseries? Are they useful or not?
Most of them are the Chinese mantid, which is big. I can show you some pictures of Chinese mantids eating hummingbirds. Probably don't want to see that. And when they're not doing that, they're eating honeybees that are flowers. You know, they're generalist predators that will grab whatever flies by. So most of the garden pests that we're talking about are not taken by mantids because they take active flying insects like our pollinators, whereas a caterpillar that's just sitting there, a mantid doesn't come up and grab it and eat it. So for the most part, no, they don't help your garden pests. We do have native mantids. They kind of drop out. I don't know if we have any. The Carolina mantid drops out around Delaware, maybe midway up Pennsylvania. So the mantid most people see is the Chinese mantid, and there's not a fine. You know, I grew up thinking there was a $50 fine if you killed a praying mantid. Not so. But no, they don't really help much.
Oh, and I had almost missed the question that says, oh, it's let's see, can butterfly bush question. Oh, it seems to me that there's, by Terry, there seems to me there's no greater debate over a native plant than that over butterfly bush. Could you address the use and popularity of this plant, please?
Okay. Butterfly bush, Buddleia. It's a non-native plant with beautiful blooms that makes lots of nectar. So it does supply nectar, and a lot of butterflies go and sip the nectar. And of course, it's called the butterfly bush. So who wouldn't think that's going to help butterflies? And in terms of supplying nectar, it does. It does. There are 2 downsides to butterfly bush. And one is the idea that if I have butterfly bush, I've helped the butterflies. You got to make butterflies to help the butterflies. You want to have the host plants that they can reproduce on so you get more butterflies, because each generation is pretty short. Butterfly bush doesn't support any butterflies in terms of reproduction. So people who think they're really helping butterfly populations, they are in terms of supplying nectar, but if that's the only thing in their yard, it's not gonna do it. The other big downside, the biggest downside to butterfly bush, is that it's obvious that it's becoming an important invasive species. There's always a lag time between the time that we bring in these non-native plants and everybody plants them and the time that they really go crazy and start invading all of our natural areas. But in several cases around the country, including Hawaii, butterfly bush has already proven to be invasive. I get them regularly in my yard. I haven't planted any of them, and so then I have to take them out. So something we know that is increasing in its invasiveness and is not contributing in a holistic way that actually produces the butterflies is going to help. Those are reasons. That's what's fueling the debate. You know, it is a beautiful ornamental. It does bring in butterflies. It's not helping any specialist bees. Let me talk briefly about bees. Bees, you know, those bees that require the pollen of particular plant genera like goldenrod, they will go and they'll sip nectar from a butterfly bush, but they they can't reproduce on it again. So it's, you know, it's like putting candy in your yard, but it's not gonna build the populations of the animals you're trying to help. So there's no doubt it's a gray area. A lot of people say, well, I'll go out and deadhead it and then it won't spread. Okay, but I know you get tired of that, and pretty soon you don't deadhead it. And we can find effective alternatives, like some of the Eupatorium's Joe Pye weed brings in just as many butterflies. It's beautiful purple in the about the same time. Doesn't bloom as long, you know, but a diversity of native plants that are blooming when the butterflies need it most, like buttonbush and sweet pepper bush, clethra. Um, what's another one? Things that bloom in midsummer. Bottlebrush buckeye, a little bit out of its range, but it's a wonderful source of nectar for butterflies. Those things can replace the nectar that your butterfly bush provides.
And then we also have a question from Chris and Teresa. They say we have a dying Norway maple and want to replace it with a native maple. How close can we plant it to the old maple?
Well, at some point, the old maple's going to come down, so you can plant it right next to it. But if you're actually going to hire a tree guy to get rid of the Norway maple when it dies, be mindful of the fact that he's got to be able to take that tree down without killing your other tree. Norway maples throw really, really deep shade. So you want to put it in the sunniest spot next to that maple so that it actually grows, because that's one of the problems with Norway maples, is that they shade out almost everything underneath them. But if it's dying, maybe you don't have that shade. But you know, when it dies, the root systems will die as well, and any tree that grew up next to it will be able to do fine as those roots die and the new roots grow. One thing you could do is make a snag out of the Norway maple. Cut off the big branches and maybe even 15 feet tall, and then it's less likely to fall over on anything, and it can provide a really good site for woodpeckers and a number of other birds to breed in over the years. And in that way, your other maple can grow up next to it without any conflict.
Oh, the patron who had asked the question is saying thank you, Chris and Terry. Oh, okay. Rebecca is asking about the mantises. Again, the Carolina mantises. And okay, they're here, but it took many years of letting an area of my yard grow completely wild and unchecked, which is not preferred by most people. And of course, not spraying any chemicals at all. The mantises came on their own and have stayed for the past 3 years. There are egg cases all over my wood fence. How can I tell if an egg case has already hatched?
Has already hatched? Yeah, because they do stay there for a couple of years. I guess if I showed you one that hadn't hatched and put it right next to one that had, you'd be able to see the difference. It's a little difficult to describe, but the baby manads crawl out through it and leave a little hole where each egg was. So you kind of have to get used to that. You can see the ones that have been around for more than a year are worn, as opposed to nice and fresh with no ragged edges. That's the best I can do.
Well, thank you everybody for your questions. I don't know if I missed any of them. Oh, there's another one that's somebody just typed. And if anybody wanted to unmute themselves and ask a question for a moment, I think we have a couple of minutes left. And then this question from Tootie is that, in the food web between insects and birds, are there insects that we can simply kill without tipping the balance? For example, cockroaches.
Sure, kill your cockroaches there. Not a lot of, it depends on where you are. Actually, cockroaches, the ones that live outside, like wood roaches and things, are an important part of the red cockaded woodpecker diet. So that's one of the endangered birds in the South. Somebody actually put a camera on the nest and look what they were bringing back, and it was like 70% wood roaches. So, but around here, the American roach or the German roach in your house, they're not part of your bird food web, so don't worry about that.
I think this question is similar. It says, Doreen writes, is there any advice for dealing with mosquitoes while not harming pollinators?
Yeah, well, that's actually a good question, because these days we have a big industry. Well, I'll just call it Mosquito Joe, who goes around and fogs. And your neighbor can hire Mosquito Joe. He fogs your neighbor's house, but that fog comes over and kills the insects on your house as well. Mosquito Joe will tell you that the fog is only killing mosquitoes. Not so. It's killing all the insects that it touches. And the most important thing is it doesn't work. In order to control mosquitoes in the adult stage, you have to kill 90% of them. Mosquito Joe kills about 10% of them, which means you have to rehire him over and over again. He also says it's a natural product, and he's right. It's a pyrethroid. It's derived from plants, but cyanide is also a natural product derived from plants, and doesn't make it safe. The big thing is that there's an alternative to Mosquito Joe, and that is try to control the mosquitoes in the larval stage. Then you do that. What you want to do is create a place where the mosquitoes are going to lay their eggs, and you want to make it irresistible. And the way you do that is get a bucket of water, big bucket, put some straw or hay into it, and let it ferment for a couple days. And that mixture becomes irresistible to ovipositing mosquitoes. They lay their eggs in there. Then you go to the hardware store and you buy what we call a mosquito dunk. It's this round, it's a whole series of round little discs, and you put one in. The eggs hatch, the larvae nibble at the mosquito dunk. It's Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural mosquito bacillus bacterium that kills it. And the advantage is it only kills mosquitoes. So you're not killing anything outside the bucket. You're not even killing any other type of, so if you get a dragonfly in your bucket, it's not going to kill them either. It's a really targeted control method, which is exactly what, it's the ideal control method, is that it's only hitting what you want to kill. So if everybody had a bucket with mosquito dunks in it, and they last about 30 days, then you renew it, put in another one, we could really knock our mosquito populations down much more effectively than Mosquito Joe does, and you can do it really cheaply. So.
Wow. What a method. Oh, we have a question from Hilder. The most concerning critic I receive of my front yard rewild habitat is that it may attract white-footed mouse and add fuel to the fire with respect to the tick-borne Lyme epidemic. How do we answer that question?
There are three components of the Lyme web, and one is the white-footed mouse and other rodents, but that's a primary one. The other one's the ticks, but then there's the deer. These ticks mate and feed on deer in the adult stage, and it's the explosion, the overpopulation of deer now in most parts of the country, but particularly in the East, that has caused the explosion of Lyme disease. When I grew up, again, in that Berkeley Heights, New Jersey, there weren't any deer. We had no deer ticks, and we had no Lyme disease. One day, there was a deer footprint in our front yard, and it was such an exciting event. We went out and made a plaster cast of it, and I had it on my bookshelf as I grew up. Never did see the deer. So that's how low the deer numbers were. So that cycle never developed. But then we created perfect deer habitat. We got rid of all the deer predators, and the deer populations exploded, and they're still way out of whack. Several times over the carrying capacity, the ability of the environment to maintain those populations in the long term. So the real way to control Lyme disease is to get the deer numbers back down. And I know all of the issues involving that. I've had people get up and walk out of my talks when I talk about controlling deer. I know that Bambi is really cute, but there's no species on Earth that can grow forever without top-down control, and that includes deer. Looks like Peter went away.
Peter, are you still there?
He might have to, he might have a connection issue and he might go out and come back. And Tuti and I had talked about the cockroaches, so I was concerned that she wouldn't ask the question, but she did. So
Okay, good. There's Peter.
I have a question about a mantid and a mantis. Are they the same thing? I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah.
We used to
The
call them.
order is called Mantodidae. Some people
Okay.
call them mantids.
Okay.
Mantis, praying mantis. It's
Yeah.
these are common name issues, but yeah, we're talking about the same creature.
Okay, so they're not really good.
The native manads are good, but in terms of buying them to control the pests in your garden, no, that's
No,
not going to work.
not a good idea.
But
Okay.
they are part of the predators that keep things in balance.
Thank you.
I'd assume that they were a native species. I guess not.
Well, the most common one, the Chinese manid, is not native, no.
No.
Dr. Tallamy, I have one more question. The use of neem oil, and I know neem is not native to the United States, it's native to India. So what do you take on the use of that to control the pest?
Well, it's an insecticide, but it does break down quickly. It's not going to linger in the environment. It is a whole lot safer than many of the any of the pesticides you'd buy on the shelf. It's fine. I'll tell you a story. I got an email just the other day of a woman who was spraying neem on her echinacea flowers. She said she's got a little beetle eating the flower petals, and she's spraying neem. And will that hurt the bees? She said she only sprays in the morning, early in the morning, before the bees are there. And I said, yes, but the neem oil is now all over the pollen and in the nectar that those bees are coming to get. So she hadn't thought about that. That's why the bees are there. So who knows what's happening back in the beehive when you spray the neem oil. I guess my first reaction is question whether or not you need to spray at all. Most people, the idea that any insect damage is going to kill the plant is simply false. I was taking a hike with my son-in-law the other day, and there was a maple tree, and it had a lot of caterpillar damage. And he said, "Well, that's going to die." I said, "No, it's not. I mean, that tree is doing its job. You can defoliate a tree, particularly one growing in a healthy situation, several years before it would actually kill it. And this was not nearly defoliated. We just have this idea that if there's any insect damage, the tree's going to die, and we have to be spraying everything. But that is just not true. So I would question whether you need to be using the neem oil at all. If you're growing a vegetable crop, that's a different story. Then you that's your food. So yeah, I think it's a better alternative than most.
Okay, thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
And Brendan has written a question. I have catalpa trees that were in my Long Island backyard when I moved in, plus a mimosa tree and a bunch of Norway maples. Are any of these helpful?
Catalpa's good. It's a native plant. It is outside of its range, but the primary, it's another one of those sphinx moss that you could have that holds that Braconid wasp. So you get the catalpa, they call it the catalpa worm. And sometimes it actually defoliates the catalpa, but people use them as fishing bait. But so the insect that uses catalpa has followed it where we planted it, and you've reestablished a connection that normally would be a little farther south, but that's okay. The mimosa tree, totally non-native, and it is invasive. It moves around. It's not contributing anything. I would get rid of that. And the Norway maple, same deal.
And then we have a comment from Rebecca who says that she watched your lectures on YouTube and inspired her to change her life and created her blog with a focus on gardening and native plants and to document her pollinator garden, and that she hopes to study landscape design and encourage others to go native.
Great. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. If anybody had any more questions before we call a conclusion to this Seed Saturday. Well, thank you. Those are some great questions, I thought, and very interesting answers. I didn't expect this, but I think that mosquito method is might have been the most interesting answer. And thank you so much for joining us today, Doug.
Yes,
Well,
Yes, thank you.
great.
Thank you. We're honored, truly.
Well, I don't know about that, but good luck to all of you. So
Thank you.
Oh, Hilda, do you have a question?
I just want to see, are you recording to share today? I would love to share with friends.
Yes.
Wonderful. So it will be accessible online.
Yes. I'll email that to everybody who's here today.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Wonderful.
Thank you. And